The morning of June 23, 1944, in a processing tent at Camp Concordia, Kansas, Unteroffizier Klaus Weber sat on a wooden bench with his hands folded in his lap, staring at a sheet of paper as if it might vanish. The paper was real, American-made, thin but sturdy, with faint blue lines. Beside it lay a stubby pencil and an envelope already addressed in his careful script to Frau Margarete Weber, Schillerstrasse 14, Heidelberg. The American corporal who had distributed these items 20 minutes earlier had explained, through a bored interpreter, that prisoners could write 1 letter per week. 1 letter. Every week. Home. Weber had not written to his wife in 7 months. Not since his unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, had been shipped to North Africa in late 1943. The last correspondence he'd managed was a field post card, one of those pre-printed forms where you crossed out the phrases that didn't apply. I am well. I am wounded. I am in hospital. No room for actual words. No space to tell Marguerite about the sand that got into everything, or the taste of British bully beef after they'd overrun a supply dump, or how he thought of her every night before sleep took him. Then came Tunisia. Then came capture, the long column of Wehrmacht soldiers shuffling through the desert with their hands raised, British tanks rumbling alongside. Then came the ship across the Atlantic, packed so tightly in the hold that men slept standing up. And finally, this place, Kansas, they said, though it might as well have been the moon for all Weber knew of American geography. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He picked up the pencil. His hand trembled slightly. This had to be a test, he reasoned, or a trick. The Americans would read whatever he wrote. Certainly censors always read letters, but what happened after that? In the propaganda films they'd shown before deployment, American soldiers were depicted as gangsters, as Indians from the Wild West films, as men who took no prisoners. The films never mentioned letters. They never mentioned weekly correspondence with home, as if such a thing were ordinary, as if it were a right rather than a privilege to be earned through blood. Weber began to write. Meine liebste Margarete, my dearest Margarete. The German words looked strange on American paper, angular and serious against the casual blue lines. He wrote that he was unharmed. He wrote that he was in a place called Kansas, in the middle of America, where the sky was wide and the summer heat reminded him of Spain before the war. He did not write that he'd expected to be shot after surrendering. He did not write that the American soldiers who'd processed him had seemed more interested in smoking cigarettes and complaining about the heat than in demonstrating the cruelty he'd been taught to expect. He wrote 3 paragraphs. It took him 40 minutes. When he finished, he read it through twice, searching for anything that might endanger Marguerite if the letter somehow made it through. Then he folded it carefully, slid it into the envelope, and handed it to the corporal making rounds. Next week? Same time, the corporal said in English. The interpreter translated, Every Thursday. You write, we send. Weber nodded. He didn't believe it. Not yet. To understand Klaus Weber's disbelief, you must first understand what he had been taught to believe about his enemy. The German soldier of 1944 was not simply a man in uniform. He was a product of years of careful ideological instruction, a student of a worldview that divided humanity into distinct categories of worth and behavior. From 1933 onward, the National Socialist government had systematically shaped German perceptions of other nations. This was not casual propaganda. It was curricula in schools, content in newspapers, dialogue in films, messages in radio broadcasts. By the time war began in 1939, an entire generation of young Germans had absorbed specific ideas about who their enemies were and what those enemies would do given the opportunity. The Americans, in this constructed narrative, occupied a particular position. They were depicted as a mongrel nation, a chaos of competing races and interests held together by greed and Jewish manipulation, this according to the ideological framework German soldiers received in their training. They were soft, the propaganda insisted, made weak by democracy and material comfort. But they were also savage when given power, capable of the kind of brutality that civilized Europeans had supposedly outgrown. These contradictions, weakness and savagery, softness and cruelty, existed side by side in the German soldiers' understanding of America. And they were reinforced by specific instructions. The Wehrmacht leadership issued guidelines for what soldiers should expect if captured. Soviet captivity meant almost certain death, this was stated plainly, and was, horrifically, often accurate. British captivity was presented as harsh but survivable. American captivity fell somewhere between, unpredictable, potentially violent, governed by men who might respect the rules of war, or might ignore them, depending on mood and circumstance. There was no mention, in any of this education, of weekly letters home. There was no discussion of the Geneva Convention protections that the United States had signed and, critically, intended to follow. The possibility that American forces might treat prisoners according to international law, might feed them adequately, might allow them regular contact with families, these ideas were absent from the German soldiers' preparation for war. This absence was not accidental. A soldier who believed capture meant torture or death would fight longer, retreat more, slowly, surrender only in the most desperate circumstances. Fear was a tactical asset. The Wehrmacht command cultivated it deliberately. So when Klaus Weber sat in that processing tent in Kansas, pencil in hand, he was not simply writing a letter. He was confronting the collapse of everything he had been taught about the nation that had defeated him. The United States military's approach to prisoner handling in World War II was built on a foundation of law, logistics, and calculated self-interest. It was not humanitarian sentiment that ensured Klaus Weber could write home every week. It was policy, and that policy had roots that extended back decades before the first shot of the war was fired. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established international standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States was a signatory. More importantly, the United States intended to comply, not from altruism, but from a clear-eyed recognition that American soldiers would also be captured, and that American treatment of enemy prisoners would directly influence how those American prisoners were treated in turn. This was the doctrine of reciprocity. It meant that every German prisoner in American hands represented, in theory, protection for an American prisoner in German hands. It meant that visible, documented compliance with Geneva Convention standards was not just moral policy but strategic necessity. The International Red Cross inspected prisoner camps, reports circulated. The world watched. And so the United States built a system designed to be watched. Camp Concordia, where Klaus Weber found himself in June of 1944, was one of hundreds of such facilities across the American interior. The camp system was vast. By war's end, more than 400,000 German prisoners would be held on American soil, in camps ranging from Texas to Maine, from California to New York. They worked in agriculture when labor was short. They received wages 80 cents per day in scrip, usable in camp canteens. They ate rations comparable to American soldiers. And they wrote letters. The letter-writing privilege was enshrined in the Geneva Convention, Article 36, which specified that prisoners must be allowed to send and receive correspondence. The American implementation of this rule was methodical. Each prisoner was permitted to send a certain number of letters and postcards per week, typically one letter and several postcards, though this varied by camp and period. All outgoing mail was censored, read by officers who searched for military intelligence, coded messages, or propaganda. Anything deemed sensitive was redacted. But the letters went out. They went out through the International Red Cross, which operated mail services between belligerent nations. They travelled circuitous routes, Kansas to New York to neutral Switzerland, Switzerland to Germany. The journey took weeks, sometimes months. But the letters arrived, and replies came back, following the same careful path in reverse. This was the system that Klaus Weber encountered. It was not warm, it was not personal, but it functioned with a reliability that bordered on the mechanical, a vast administrative apparatus designed to process human connection across battle lines, to maintain a thread of communication even as nations tried to destroy each other. For a German soldier raised on propaganda about American chaos and brutality, this systematic efficiency was perhaps more shocking than kindness would have been. Klaus Weber received his first reply on August 9, 1944. 7 weeks had passed since he'd written that initial letter, 7 weeks during which he'd begun to accept that perhaps the weekly letter privilege was real, that perhaps the Americans meant what they said. He'd written 6 more letters in that time, one each Thursday, describing the flat Kansas landscape, the work details in surrounding farms, the strange American food white bread that tasted like sweetened air, coffee so weak it barely deserved the name. He wrote carefully, assuming censors read every word, but he wrote honestly about the mundane details of captivity that he thought Marguerite would want to know. The reply came in a Red Cross envelope, his wife's handwriting instantly recognizable, despite its journey across an ocean and a continent. The American corporal who distributed mail called out names in badly pronounced German, and when Weber heard Weber, he stood so quickly he knocked over the stool he'd been sitting on. His hands shook as he took the envelope. Around him, other prisoners were receiving letters too, and the mail tent filled with a strange, suppressed emotion, men holding paper as if it were something alive and fragile. Weber walked back to his barracks before opening it. He needed privacy for this, even the limited privacy of a bunk in a room he shared with 30 other men. He sat on the thin mattress, turned the envelope over twice, then carefully tore it open along the seam. Marguerite had written 4 pages. 4 pages in her neat, slanted script, telling him that his first letter had arrived in late July, that she'd wept when she saw it, that she'd shown it to his mother and his sister and the neighbors who'd assumed he was dead. She wrote about rationing in Heidelberg, about the air raids that came now with increasing frequency, about how their apartment had lost 2 windows in a raid in June but was otherwise intact. She wrote about small things, the cat from upstairs that had adopted her, the vegetable garden she'd started in the courtyard, the way summer light came through the kitchen window in the early morning. She did not write about victory. She did not write about faith in final triumph or the rhetoric that still poured from German radio. She wrote as if the war were weather, something to be endured rather than won, something that happened to people, rather than something people chose. And at the end, she wrote, "Write again soon. Knowing you are alive and safe is the only thing that makes this bearable." Weber read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the small cardboard box under his bunk, where he kept his few possessions, a testament the Red Cross had distributed, a photograph of Marguerite from before the war, a spare shirt. He sat there for perhaps 10 minutes, not moving, not thinking, just existing in the space between his old understanding of the world and whatever new understanding was forming. That evening, he wrote back. He told her he'd received her letter. He told her he was well. He told her about the work detail he'd been assigned to, harvesting wheat on a farm 20 miles from camp, and how the American farmer and his wife had given the prisoners cold water and sandwiches at midday, had treated them not as enemies but as labor, as men doing a job. He told her that he would write, again next week, and the week after, and the week after that, for as long as the Americans allowed it. He did not tell her that this simple exchange of letters was reshaping his understanding of capture, of enemy, of what it meant to be defeated. Some realizations were too large to fit into words, especially words that censors would read. Weber's experience was not unique. Across the American camp system, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were undergoing the same disorienting discovery that the enemy they'd been taught to fear and despise was, in the realm of prisoner treatment, remarkably predictable and often startlingly humane. The statistics reveal the scale of this collision between expectation and reality. By the end of 1945, the United States held approximately 378,000 German prisoners of war on American soil. The death rate among these prisoners was less than 1%, a figure that stood in stark contrast to German and Soviet camps, where prisoner mortality often reached 30 or 40%. German prisoners in American camps received 2,700 calories per day, only slightly less than American soldiers received. They had access to medical care that, in many cases, exceeded what was available to German civilians in bombed cities back home. And they wrote letters. The postal system that supported this communication was enormous. The office of the Provost Marshal General, which oversaw prisoner operations, processed millions of pieces of mail during the war years. Each letter was read by censors, examined for intelligence value, checked for coded messages or propaganda. The censorship process employed hundreds of officers fluent in German, many of them German-American citizens or refugees from Nazi Germany, who brought intimate knowledge of language and culture to the task. What the censors found, as the war progressed, was illuminating. Early letters from German prisoners often expressed suspicion or confusion about their treatment. They wrote carefully, assuming their captors were looking for excuses to punish them. They sometimes included phrases clearly designed to satisfy potential censors, statements about fair treatment that read as compelled rather than genuine. But as weeks became months, the tone shifted. Prisoners began writing about details that suggested a grudging acceptance of their circumstances. They described camp football leagues organized by prisoners themselves, with American guards providing balls and goals. They mentioned camp newspapers printed in German, educational courses taught by fellow prisoners, theatrical productions staged in camp auditoriums. They wrote about American guards who were bored rather than brutal, who sometimes shared cigarettes or complained about their own officers, who seemed to view guard duty as an inconvenient job rather than an ideological mission. The replies from Germany painted a contrasting picture. Families wrote about shortages that grew more severe as the war continued. They wrote about air raids that destroyed neighborhoods, about food rations that shrank month by month, about the increasing desperation of daily life in a losing nation. They wrote, often in veiled language to avoid their own censors, about fears for the future and doubts about the promises still being broadcast from Berlin. The divergence was stark. German prisoners in America were eating regularly, sleeping in beds, working for wages, and writing home weekly. Their families in Germany were hungry, bombed, and increasingly uncertain whether the state that had promised them greatness would survive the year. The prisoners could see this disparity in every letter they received. They could measure it in the weight of their own bodies compared to the descriptions of hunger from home. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This was not the narrative they'd been promised. The propaganda that had prepared them for war had never mentioned this possibility that defeat might mean safety, that capture might mean survival, that the enemy might treat them better than their own government could now manage for its civilians. The weekly letters did more than maintain family connections. They created a cognitive crisis for many German prisoners, a sustained confrontation with evidence that contradicted the ideological foundation of their military service. Consider the specific case of Lieutenant Friedrich Guggenberger, a submarine officer captured in May of 1944 after his U-boat was sunk in the Atlantic. Guggenberger was held at Camp Papago Park in Arizona, a facility that housed primarily German officers. His letters, portions of which survived in censorship records, reveal the progression of his thinking over the course of his captivity. In his first letter, written in June of 1944, Guggenberger told his wife that he was alive and unharmed. The tone was formal, careful. He described his capture in neutral terms and his current situation in even more neutral terms: adequate food, tolerable climate, no mistreatment. The letter read as if he expected it to be the only communication he'd be allowed. By September, his fourth letter showed a different awareness. He wrote about receiving her replies, about the relief of knowing she and their children were safe despite the intensifying air campaign against German cities. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he was teaching mathematics to other prisoners in camp, that the Americans had provided textbooks and allowed the organization of educational programs. The tone was still measured, but something had shifted. He was describing a routine, a life that extended beyond mere survival. By January of 1945, with Germany clearly losing the war, Guggenberger's letters had evolved again. He wrote more openly about his reading. The Americans allowed prisoners access to German-language books, including some that had been banned in Germany, and about discussions among the officers regarding what would happen after the war. He asked his wife practical questions. Was their house still standing? Were the children getting enough food? Should they consider moving to the countryside where supplies might be more available? These were the questions of a man thinking about a future beyond German victory, beyond the ideological certainties that had guided his service. They were the questions of someone whose framework for understanding the world had been fundamentally disrupted by the simple, repeated experience of humane treatment from an enemy who was supposed to be incapable of it. The psychological impact of this disruption was not uniform. Some prisoners clung to National Socialist ideology, interpreting their treatment as a temporary aberration or as weakness on the part of the Americans. These men often organized themselves into groups within camps, enforcing ideological discipline and threatening prisoners who expressed doubt or gratitude toward their captors. But many others experienced what camp administrators and later historians would recognize as a profound disillusionment. The weekly letters home served as a constant reminder that the reality of American captivity did not match the predictions of German propaganda. Each letter written was evidence of a privilege that should not exist according to what they'd been taught. Each reply received was confirmation that this privilege was not a temporary trick but a sustained policy. Over time, this accumulation of evidence became impossible to ignore or rationalize away. The end of the war in May of 1945 brought a new crisis for German prisoners in American camps. Victory meant decisions had to be made who would be repatriated and when, who would face war crimes, tribunals, how hundreds of thousands of men would be returned to a Germany that no longer existed in the form they'd left it. For many prisoners, the prospect of going home was more frightening than captivity had ever been. Klaus Weber wrote to Marguerite in June of 1945 with questions he could not have imagined asking a year earlier. Should he try to delay his return? Heidelberg was now in the American occupation zone. Was there still a home to return to? Were there jobs? Was there food? Was there any structure left to civilian life? Her reply took 3 weeks to arrive. The postal system was disrupted by the collapse of the German state, but the Red Cross still operated, still moved letters across the ruins of Europe. Margarete wrote that she wanted him home, but she wrote with a clarity about conditions that would have been censored a year earlier. The city was damaged but not destroyed. Food was scarce, but the Americans were organizing distributions. There was no work yet, but there would be eventually. She wrote, "It will be hard, but we will manage. We always have." Weber was repatriated in September of 1945. He traveled by ship from New York to Le Havre, then by train through France and into the American zone of Germany. The journey took 3 weeks. He carried with him everything he owned: a change of clothes, his testament, the photograph of Marguerite, and a cardboard box containing every letter she had sent him during his 18 months of captivity. 28 letters in total, each one read and reread, until the paper had grown soft at the creases. Years later, in an interview conducted for a German historical archive in 1968, Weber would try to explain what those letters had meant. "They kept me human," he said. "In captivity, you can lose yourself. You can become only a prisoner, only a number. The letters reminded me I was still Klaus, still a husband, still connected to something beyond the wire." But then he'd add, something more complex. "They also forced me to see that we had been lied to, not about everything, but about the Americans, about what capture would mean, about who the enemy really was. That knowledge was bitter. It meant accepting that we had believed things that were not true, had fought for things that were built on lies. This was the cost of truth that many German prisoners paid, not in blood or hunger, but in the dismantling of certainties they had carried through the war. The weekly letters had been a privilege under the Geneva Convention, a humanitarian measure designed to maintain prisoner morale and family connections. But they had also become something else, a sustained form of evidence, a weekly confrontation with the gap between what German soldiers had been taught to expect and what they actually experienced. The American military understood this. at least partially. Reports from the Provost Marshal General's office noted that male privileges contributed significantly to camp stability. Prisoners who could write home, who could maintain family connections, were less likely to cause disciplinary problems, less likely to attempt escape, more cooperative with camp administration. This was calculated policy humanitarian treatment as a form of control, kindness as a strategic asset. But the effects went deeper than mere camp management. The letters created witnesses. Every German prisoner who wrote home about adequate food, about medical care, about being treated according to law rather than caprice, became a source of information that contradicted official German propaganda. Their families received this information, shared it with neighbors, and gradually, a counter-narrative spread through German society that perhaps the Americans were not the savages they'd been depicted as, that perhaps the war had been fought on false premises. The American treatment of German prisoners during World War II stands as one of the more remarkable administrative achievements of the conflict, remarkable not for drama or heroism, but for its systematic consistency. More than 370,000 German prisoners were held on American soil between 1943 and 1946. The vast majority returned home alive, and many returned with experiences that fundamentally challenged the ideology they had carried into battle. This outcome was not inevitable. The United States could have chosen differently. The Geneva Convention provided standards, but enforcement was voluntary, and international oversight was limited during wartime. Other nations, Germany in the East, Japan throughout its empire, the Soviet Union across all fronts demonstrated that prisoner treatment could range from neglect to systematic extermination. The American choice to comply with Geneva standards, to allow weekly letters and maintain adequate conditions, was a choice that required resources, organization, and sustained political will. The postal system alone represented a significant investment. Millions of letters processed, thousands of censors employed, coordination with the International Red Cross maintained across years of war. This infrastructure served no immediate military purpose. It did not shorten the war or save American lives in any direct sense. But it served a longer purpose, one that would become apparent only after the fighting ended. Post-war reconstruction of West Germany depended partly on German citizens who had learned, through prisoner experiences or through letters from prisoners, that cooperation with American occupation might be preferable to resistance. The Marshall Plan's success required German acceptance of American guidance, and that acceptance was easier to achieve among populations who had evidence that Americans could be trusted to keep their word, to follow rules, to treat defeated enemies as human beings rather than as objects of vengeance. This is not to suggest that American policy was purely altruistic or that all prisoners experienced identical treatment. There were variations between camps, instances of mistreatment, failures of oversight. African American guards sometimes faced hostility from German prisoners who brought Nazi racial ideology into captivity, creating tensions that camp administrators struggled to manage. Prisoners suspected of war crimes faced harsher conditions and eventual prosecution. The system was not perfect, but the system existed, functioned, and largely succeeded in its stated goals. German prisoners ate adequately, survived at rates comparable to American soldiers stationed domestically, and maintained family contact throughout their captivity. These outcomes were remarkable precisely because they were unremarkable. They represented the routine implementation of international law at a scale and consistency rarely achieved before or since. The letters themselves, millions of them, have mostly vanished into private family archives or been lost to time. But fragments survive in censorship records, in historical archives, in the occasional memoir or oral history. They reveal ordinary people writing ordinary things, complaints about food, questions about children, expressions of love and longing and hope. They reveal, in their very ordinariness, something profound about the gap between propaganda and reality, between what the German military told its soldiers to expect from capture and what those soldiers actually experienced. Friedrich Guggenberger, the submarine officer whose letters tracked his evolving understanding of captivity, returned to Germany in 1946. He became a teacher, wrote occasional articles about his naval service, and died in 1988. In his later writings, he reflected on the cognitive dissonance of his prisoner experience, the confusion of being treated humanely by an enemy he'd been taught to view as brutal, the slow realization that much of what he'd believed about the war had been constructed from lies and half-truths. "The letters home," he wrote in a 1972 essay, "were the thread that kept us connected to reality. But they also revealed that reality was different than we'd been told it would be." Klaus Weber died in Heidelberg in 1993, 48 years after returning from American captivity. He had worked as a clerk, raised 2 children with Marguerite, lived a quiet life in a rebuilt Germany that bore little resemblance to the nation he'd fought for. Among his possessions, his children found the cardboard box containing 28 letters from their mother, written between June of 1944 and September of 1945, preserved carefully across 5 decades. They found something else, too, a letter Weber had written but never sent, dated May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. In it, he addressed his younger self, the soldier who had believed the propaganda about American savagery, who had expected capture to mean torture or death. "You were wrong," the letter said. "Not about everything, but about this. The Americans were not what we were told they would be. They followed rules we did not know they followed. They treated us as men when we had been taught they would treat us as animals. This does not erase what we did. It does not excuse the war we fought, but it reveals that we fought it believing things that were not true. This revelation that the enemy was not as portrayed, that propaganda had constructed a false reality, was the lasting cost and gift of the weekly letters home. The cost was disillusionment, the collapse of certainties that had given meaning to service and sacrifice. The gift was truth, uncomfortable and unwelcome perhaps, but truth nonetheless. The American policy of allowing German prisoners to write home every week was not dramatic. It involved no battles, no moments of individual heroism, no decisive turning points in the war's outcome. It was administrative, bureaucratic, a matter of processing forms and moving mail and maintaining records. But for hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, it became the mechanism through which they discovered that their understanding of the enemy had been fundamentally wrong. This discovery did not happen in a single moment. It happened slowly, letter by letter, week by week, as the accumulation of small mercies, a sheet of paper, a pencil, an envelope revealed a pattern of behavior that contradicted everything they'd been prepared to expect. The Americans fed them. The Americans housed them. The Americans let them write home. Not because they were soft, not because they lacked the will to be cruel, but because they had decided that law and consistency served their purposes better than vengeance would. In the end, the story of Klaus Weber and thousands like him is not about the grand strategies of World War II or the dramatic battles that determined its outcome. It is about a smaller, stranger collision between propaganda and reality, between what soldiers believed about their enemy and what they discovered through experience. It is about the power of small, sustained acts of humanity to undermine ideological certainty, and about the letters that travelled across continents and battle lines to reveal that truth, even uncomfortable truth, could be delivered one envelope at a time. The weekly letters home were never meant to be weapons, but in their quiet way, they were weapons against certainty, against propaganda, against the lies that make wars possible. They could not stop the war, but they could, and did, change how thousands of men understood the war they had fought and lost. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.